Quaker Inn on the campus of the University of Akron. The radio broadcast is underwritten by Cascade Audi. Today's program is generously sponsored by Kent State University. Additionally, we would like to recognize the Akron Beacon Journal, Kiwanis Club of Akron, and the Greater Akron Chamber for being legacy sponsors. Please mark your calendar now for our next roundtable scheduled on Thursday, September 17th, when the Akron Roundtable will host John Norquist, past president and CEO of the Congress for the New Urbanism and former mayor of Milwaukee. His topic will be the New Urbanism. To make a reservation for any of the Akron Roundtable luncheons or to purchase a subscription to our luncheon series, please visit our website at akronroundtable.org. Today, the Akron Roundtable is pleased to host Dr. Danielle Sarver Coombs, author and associate professor at Kent State University, whose remarks are titled, "Come to the Party, Leave the Flip-Flopping at Home, Essential Lessons from the 2012 Republican Primaries." I can't think of a more timely topic given where we're at in the election cycle. I will now ask Amy Reynolds, Dean of Kent State University's College of Communication and Information, to introduce our presenter.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I've only been at Kent State for a couple of months now. I came here from Louisiana State University, and I'm just sort of making my way around and getting to meet everyone and talk with the faculty. But I have known of Dr. Danielle Sarver Coombs' work prior to my arrival here. When I was at LSU, one of my jobs was to oversee our doctoral program. And when I would talk to people about important alums, successful alums, people who had done great work after they left the program, Danielle's name is always the one that is at the top of the list. So it's really a privilege to get to introduce her to you today. She has a lot of professional accomplishments that are listed in your program, so I will not go through that long list of things because otherwise you wouldn't have time to speak. But I would encourage you to read that bio because Danielle has done some really interesting and wonderful work. But I do want to highlight that in addition to Danielle's wonderful scholarship and her, she's a very gifted teacher, that she's also a leader on our faculty. She's really done great work in serving in various administrative roles in our School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And what's really impressive to me is Danielle is someone who knows how to get things done. Right? A lot of times in academia, we get criticized for moving at too slow of a pace or liking our committees so much those committees don't actually get things done. But when Danielle is taking the lead and is in charge of these things, we make progress, and I think that's really important. I'm also really glad that she is so service-minded. She's willing to share her research and her ideas with you today because I think that's an important aspect of what we do in the academy is not just produce great research, but share it with the broader community so that we can engage with people and really have really good, important conversations. I'd like to mention to you that you will appreciate, I think, the depth of Danielle's understanding of political communication as she talks with you today. But I would encourage you to also consider two other aspects of her background. She has two books that are forthcoming at the end of this year. One of them is entitled Debates for the Digital Age, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of Our Online World. The second book is titled Female Fans of the NFL, Taking Their Place in the Stands. And Danielle has really not only established herself as an important voice in political communication, but also in sports communication, sports media, issues with gender and PR and marketing and those kinds of things. So you all like sports in Akron and Cleveland, right? I think maybe a little bit, so she might be a good speaker to come back and talk about those things at another time. Today, Dr. Sarver Coombs is going to talk about what we've learned from the 2012 Republican primaries. And I've not actually talked with Danielle about what she's going to say today, but I'm not sure I would be surprised if we heard the name Donald Trump, even though I don't believe he sucked the oxygen out of the room in 2012 as he has been lately. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Danielle Sarver Coombs.
Good? All right. So thank you all so much for being here today. It is an honor and a privilege to speak at the Akron Roundtable. I want to thank Mike and Elizabeth and the rest of the board of directors and Dean Reynolds for having me here today. This is a huge honor, I think, for anyone to come to the Akron Roundtable and speak. But it's particularly meaningful to me because my family's from Akron. This is where my roots are. When Elizabeth and I were first talking about what I would talk about today, one thing that we were discussing was that the whole theme has been bringing the world to Akron, right? And for me, it was sort of an interesting contrast because I've traveled all over and lived all over, and yet I wanted to move back here because this is where my roots are. I grew up in Macedonia and went to Nordonia High School and the Nordonia school system. And what we realized is, yeah, go Knights, all right? And what we realized is that my family has been here for almost 100 years. Next year will mark the century that, the centennial anniversary for both the Zepkos and Alexanders, the two sides of my mom's family. Whereas my dad's family, they're kind of newbies. They've only been here since World War II. So they're still earning their street cred in Akron, but we're working towards it. If you've ever been to South Akron, some of you who or have been around Akron for a while may have known the Zepco grocery store, which is at Miami and Crozier intersection. And my grandpa, John Alexander, was part of the team that made the Y Bridge happen. So not many kids get to drive down Route 8 to visit their grandparents and wave at the Y Bridge and say, hey, hi, Grandpa's Bridge. So we're pretty proud about that. Perhaps my most famous Akron relative that I have to name drop is my Uncle Tony Galati. So if you're ever at Luigi's, anyone been to Luigi's? You know, we get to pretend we're not there for the pizza and pasta, but to see Uncle Tony Galati's bowling pictures up on the wall. So we're pretty proud of these connections. Now, what's great about this, because my family is so big, I never am in a group of more than 40 people in Akron when I'm not related to at least one of them, right? That's sort of my claim to fame. Today I stacked the deck. I have a whole table full of family here, so thank you guys for joining us. I'm pleased to have you. And what I've found is that I always get a sort of spark of joy when I get to tell people I'm from Northeast Ohio. I'm so proud of being from here. And it's always been a good conversation starter, because when I tell people I'm from Ohio, inevitably they want to talk politics, right? They want to talk about elections, they want to talk about campaigns, they want to hear what's happening in Ohio. You know, people who are from states where they don't get phone calls a year out from the election every 5 minutes to talk about the candidates don't understand that phenomenon and want to hear about it. So it's a pretty great connection and a spark for discussions. Now, we've always known in Ohio that we're sort of the heart of it all, right, when it comes to politics. We've always known that we're where it's happened, but we have science to back us up now. Ohio has voted for the winning candidate in the last 13 election cycles, which is pretty remarkable when you think about what that means. The last 13 election cycles, we voted for the president. Not only that, we actually have the closest vote total to the national average out of any state. If you look at how Ohio has voted since 1964, right? Since 1964, we've only been on average 1.3 percentage points off from the national vote total. That's pretty remarkable. For context, the average over all 50 states is 6.9 points, so more than 5 times what Ohio has. So we're clearly really good at picking a president. And that is part of why I thought it'd be so interesting to write this book, Last Man Standing, Media Framing in the 2012 Republican Primaries. The genesis for this, I have 2 daughters, and at the time of the primaries, this time it was heating up for the last cycle in 2011, I had a 1-year-old and a newborn. And so I spent a lot of nights up on my computer with a crying baby, looking at news and watching television and trying to figure out what was happening, and I was fascinated. Because you had this pretty amazing race. Particularly in August, it started to get very interesting because they were begging Rick Perry to come in, right? Mitt Romney was a candidate, there were all these candidates running, but they really wanted Rick Perry to come in. And if you recall what happened, Rick Perry came in, set it on fire, and then started to debate, and things fell apart. And so it was a really wonderful opportunity to think about what happens presidential primaries. And so I wound up writing a book about it. Now, what I want to make clear is that I'm not a political scientist, I'm a media scholar. And this book isn't a political scientist approach to understanding what happened in those primaries. It's from a media perspective. And this is important because the media are what help us understand the world, right? The media help us understand who the candidates are, what they stand for, what's important, and they tell us what we should know about them. And so that's what this book does. It really helps us understand those media frames to make sense of what we learned as media consumers about our politicians and issues that are important, to our world today. And so going into the 2012 primaries, to take you back a little bit, it was looking really good for Republicans. right? The economy, still not doing great. There was a remarkably successful turnout in 2010 for the midterm elections. The Tea Party had really sort of established itself as a force to be reckoned with. So there was a lot of excitement going into these primaries for the Republicans. And Obama was considered quite vulnerable, so there was a very good chance that they could be picking the next president of the United States. So even on election night, it was still considered too close to call. You guys remember, they're telling us, like, buckle in, we're gonna be here for the long ride, get your snacks ready for a night in front of the television. And that didn't happen. By 11:15, Fox News called Ohio for Obama, and it was over. Romney's presidential campaign had ended, and Obama was gonna continue as the president of the United States. And when the votes were all counted, Obama had beaten Romney both in terms of popular vote and electoral vote, so it wasn't even close, right? It was a pretty decisive victory. So in trying to explain what happened, that sort of Monday morning quarterbacking that happens after an election, looking back, there were a couple big themes that happened to emerge about what happened with Romney the candidate. One of those schools of thought was that Romney went too far to the right during the primaries, and thus he couldn't appeal to moderate voters when it came to the actual general election. How many of you remember the Etch-a-Sketch comment? Right? So Romney's campaign team had a sort of infamous quote coming out of the primaries where they said, oh, well, just like an Etch-a-Sketch, right? So you could just reshake it and have a blank slate to start with. Well, you don't. In today's media environment, you can't get a blank slate. You're on record. You're on the internet, you're on television, you're on YouTube. People can find out what you said, so it's very hard to sort of shift between the right and the center as you're going through this process, or as we're seeing in 2016 cycle, to shift from the left to the center. The other school of thought about Romney was that he wasn't actually authentically conservative enough, meaning that he really couldn't get the Tea Partiers excited. The Tea Partiers reshaped the Republican Party, and he couldn't really handle that very, very well because he wasn't seen as authentically conservative. The position that was taken by people in this school of thought was that Romney had temporarily adopted the core conservative values while he was in the primaries, but they didn't have any faith that would continue, and they felt like he would go right back to being the Massachusetts governor before he actually went into the office. So outside of Romney the candidate, another issue was that the structure of the primaries didn't work to the candidate's favor. One of the big things was that the sheer number of debates made this very, very difficult. They held 27 debates between March 11th and May 2012. March 2011 and May 2012. So in a very short period of time, they had 27 debates. Now, there's some discussion, depending on whose candidate you're advocating for, about whether or not it was a good thing. But what this did do was it allowed marginal candidates or candidates who wouldn't naturally be considered viable, electable candidates to get onto the screen and get screen time and be able to talk to voters. Now, for some, you would position that and say, hey, this is great. That means we get to hear from people we might not otherwise get to hear from. But other people said, they're hijacking the discussion. They're coming in sort of guns blazing, and they're shifting the discussion from what needs to be said. This also created countless sound bites of off-the-cuff statements that could get then played over and over and over, often to a candidate's detriment. And I think we can just ask Rick Perry about that, including the 3 departments that he might like to cut from the federal government. So outside of the structural problems with the debate, we also had what at the time seemed like a very crowded field. And now I feel like we were so innocent when we thought 10 candidates were a lot to be running for president. When they initially started the primary sort of in earnest, there were 3 broad tiers of candidates. You had the governors, right? And this included the top tier candidates on paper. These are the ones that the pundits and the specialists are saying, these are the ones who are actually electable. And that included John Huntsman, Tim Pawlenty, and Mitt Romney. Out of those, Mitt Romney was the only one at that time who had widespread name recognition, and probably the only one now that most of us remember. You also had the Tea Party conservatives. You had Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich, and Rick Santorum, who were sort of running on that very conservative new position in the Republican Party. And then you had the libertarians, Gary Johnson and Ron Paul. So eventually others joined in, notably Rick Perry, as I mentioned. And there were a lot of names thrown around for people who they were trying to get to run, but ultimately decided not to. And that includes Chris Christie, Mike Huckabee, and of course, Donald Trump, who are all running now in 2016. So there are some commonalities between that pool of candidates and what we see right now in the Republican Party. They're primarily white men. There are a lot of former governors. And once you weren't governors, usually were senators or are senators. You had at least one woman, Michelle Bachmann to today's Carly Fiorina. You had one candidate of color, Herman Cain, to today's Ben Carson. And then you had the vanity candidates, who no one quite knows what's going on. Are they trying to sell more books, or do they genuinely want to be president? That was Newt Gingrich. And today, Donald Trump. So there was a great joke Seth Meyers told at the 2011 Correspondents' Dinner, White House Correspondents Association dinner. Just look at the options the Republicans are kicking around. Palin, Huckabee, Gingrich, Trump. That doesn't sound like a field of candidates. That sounds like season 13 of Dancing with the Stars. And that was very typical for how a lot of this primary work was covered, that this was spectacle, this was entertainment. You had these people out there who no one was quite sure whether or not to take them seriously. They were saying things that sort of on the face were a little bit absurd, making some serious gaffes and not seeing the repercussions of those. And so there was a high element of spectacle, including the debates, which were referred to as a reality show. You know, that this became a reality show that was the Republican campaigns for the primary, during the primary season. Now, during this period, Mitt Romney, who had been in the lead most of the time, sort of consistently stayed steady, right? But the characterization was he was just sort of plodding along. He wasn't making big mistakes. He wasn't, really taken out, but he just sort of kept going. He wasn't exciting, he wasn't inspiring, but he wasn't screwing up. And meanwhile, he was surrounded by this cast of characters that were like shooting stars. They would burst past him, and there would be these shining lights that would then sort of explode, sometimes somewhat spectacularly, as they were in the public spotlight. So, Michelle Bachmann is a really good example of this. Michelle Bachmann got a huge, huge boost from an early debate, right? So in June, she did extremely well, unexpectedly well, because again, there were very low expectations for her going in, so it was pretty easy for her to win the expectation game. But she went into a June debate and came out of it and had this quote about her in a CNN article. To liberals, Michelle Bachmann is a right-wing extremist who plays loose with the facts. To Tea Party activists, she is a hero willing to stand up not just to the Obama agenda, but to her own party's leadership. Like her or not, there is no disputing this. At this moment, she is the candidate making the greatest impact on the race for the Republican nomination. This is important because she was seen as being authentic. She was seen as being truly conservative, having those core values that Romney wasn't supposed to have, that Romney wasn't associated with. She was that sort of authentic conservative candidate. And as I wrote, while her incendiary rhetoric and factual inaccuracies had led to earlier perceptions that Bachmann was unelectable, these same characteristics fed the fire and fanned the flames among Republicans frustrated with what they felt was inefficiency, ineptitude, and a rejection of fundamental American values in Washington. Bachmann was willing to speak the truth, even if those truths were in opposition to her party's leaders, because she was perceived to prioritize conservative values over popular appeal. For her audience, there was no question that at her core, she meant every word she said. And I think we see very strong connections to what we talk about now with Trump. So while Bachmann led the polls in July and actually won the Iowa straw poll in August, within a very short period of time, she was nothing more than a blip in the polls. Because during that period, other candidates emerged, and this included the aforementioned Rick Perry. Donors were begging him to come in, party insiders were begging him to come in and sort of save the spectacle that was the primary season. And then when he got to the debates, he couldn't handle it. And Britt Hume sort of famously said, Perry really did throw up all over himself at the debate at a time when he needed to raise his game. Not the review you want. It's also gross, but it's not the review you want if you're running for president and in the debates. And so, one by one, these candidates jumped into the forefront and then collapsed under the pressure. An important thing to remember is that oftentimes candidates who have not been under the national spotlight before can't stand up to the media scrutiny. Once people start really digging into their backgrounds, digging into their positions, digging into their bank accounts, digging into their donation histories, looking at their associations, they can't handle that sort of pressure. A great example of this is Herman Cain, who had really started to explode. He had the 999 during the debate. He was exciting, he was new, he was innovative. And then people started digging, and all of a sudden there's this hush money getting paid out, and there were allegations of sexual harassment at work, and then this mistress. And so Herman Cain, who had sort of had a lot of excitement, couldn't withstand that sort of scrutiny. And not many politicians can. Whether or not they're seasoned, even local people who've succeeded at the local or state level, when they get that level of media scrutiny, they can't survive. And that's really why media scrutiny is so important. The media takes on our responsibility of investigating these candidates and making sure that the people who are making it to that highest level are people who should be, and that we sort of know what's underneath the rock when it gets flipped over. And that's a very important role that the media play. So within this environment, other potentially promising candidates just couldn't get traction. And that's what we saw with those governors, with Pawlenty and with Huntsman. They just couldn't get a buzz, they couldn't get energy, and so they eventually fell to the wayside. And meanwhile, Romney was running a war of attrition, and he was fighting to be the last man standing, right? He wasn't screwing up. He was running a campaign that was steady and consistent, but he could never quite capture the imagination of the public or of the media. There are very clear frames that emerged for Romney. One, that he was a robot, right? He had data-driven decisions that were made. They were not made on emotion, right? That he was a data fact guy based on numbers. And he didn't have those emotional connections to people that other candidates did really, really well. He also he couldn't shake the idea that he was a flip-flopper. This was something that came from his previous campaigns. People really felt like Romney never actually meant it when he said anything. It didn't matter if science had changed in the 15 years since he had last made a statement about it. He was a flip-flopper. He didn't hold true to his core convictions. So he really never had the chance to say, you know, here's how I've grown or emerged. Everything was questioned and everything was considered a political decision, that he was making that decision because he's a shapeshifter who was running for president. And then he's a millionaire. Mitt Romney, like many, many candidates, has a lot of money. But he was known as the guy with a lot of money, in part because he kept making the statements where he would talk about how much money he has. And people noticed. And so, you know, someone asked him about NASCAR, and he says, oh, I've got a friend who owns a NASCAR team. Most of us don't, right? So you compare that to, you know, in 2016 to Kasich, whose dad's a mailman, you know, it's quite a different role. So on paper, he was a great candidate. Mitt Romney was a great candidate on paper for the mainstream Republicans, but he never got buy-in for the Tea Partiers. Part of the problem was that he had been perceived to have been running since he lost to McCain in 2008. So there was a perception he never stopped running for president for 4 years, that he kept working toward that goal, and everybody knew he would run. He was inevitable. And so that meant that between his sort of history of long-term campaigning, the perception that he was highly political, too political, and the Tea Partiers just didn't like him, that meant he had a long, hard fight through the primaries, and that clearly established media frames sort of tanked him during that period. So as I wrote, by the time he won the primaries, the frames mainstream media used to shape narratives about and around Romney were clear and consistent. He and his campaign team faced a daunting challenge. How do you convince voters to support someone they believe to be a shape-shifting, flip-flopping millionaire robot? Clearly they didn't, and Obama won handily. So what does this mean for 2016, right? What does this mean for now? Well, what we're starting to see are some of the same patterns. One thing that we see is that inevitables, those candidates who, you know, seemed inevitable that they would run, they're having a rough time. You know, Hillary Clinton is still the clear choice, clear front runner for the Democratic nomination, but she's got baggage, and some of that baggage may be lost in cyberspace. So again, her campaign has felt inevitable since she lost to Obama in 2008. We knew she was going to run. You know, she took on office during that period and created more areas where investigations continue. And there's only so much you can take before it starts to really become the sort of old proverb where there's smoke, there's fire, right? And so people start to believe, well, there must be something here for having all these investigations, all these scandals. Eventually, you know, we're going to have to answer that question, how much can she withstand? Part of the problem with being part of this dynasty is that the Clintons are seen as very political, and by some are thought to be willing to win at all costs. So for example, how many have heard the whole false flag Trump campaign? Anyone heard this? Yeah, there's speculation that Bill Clinton told Donald Trump to run for president, right? And so he told Donald Trump to run for president to sort of disrupt the Republican primaries to help Hillary win down the road. Now, you know, it's Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, so two big characters that people like to talk about. But the thing is, because Hillary Clinton is the kind of politician that she and her family have been for a long time, people believe it. They're more likely to believe it. It gets coverage, even if it's sort of an absurd theory, right? And so people will buy it because there's been so much scandal and unrest around the Clintons. Now, you know, it speaks to her vulnerabilities, and we also see that with Jeb Bush, who's also trying to deal with that dynasty element. Jeb Bush is not a great retail politician. He's not great at sort of handshaking stuff. He doesn't have that one-of-you angle that so many other presidential candidates do. So when Kasich says, my dad was a mailman, what does Bush say? Oh, my dad was president, and so was my brother. You know, it's not the best way to connect with the everyday voter. And so what we're seeing is that that dynasty doesn't necessarily work. Now, one of the challenges is that you have to answer for the scandals and the mistakes of other people. So Hillary Clinton is inextricably linked to Bill Clinton. She can't be separated from the scandals of his era. Now, there are some great things about being part of the Clinton political tradition, right? But again, when you have this sort of overall message that, the Clintons are going to do whatever it takes to get elected, that can start to hurt her. Jeb Bush, he is being asked to answer for his brother's decision about Iraq, and that hasn't gone well for him. And so this is something we see with these dynasty candidates that other candidates don't have to face. They're having to answer for other people. We also have the challenge that between the Bushes and the Clintons, we have 28 years of presidential control since 1980 with those two families. People start to question, do we want another 8? Which is really what we're looking at here. If we elect a president for a 4-year term, odds are fairly good they'll get reelected again. Do we want another 8 years added to that total? And so these are questions people are asking, and they're good questions, and they're important questions. And this is also part and parcel of what we saw with the Republicans in 2012 and now again in 2016. Voters are tired. They're tired of Washington, and particularly on the Republican side, they are really, really tired of people being political, and they want someone who feels more honest and true. So, which leads to the next big thing for 2016. People on paper who should be top-tier candidates are not being heard, or as I like to call it, the Trump effect. No one knows what the Trump effect will be. He's very Bachman-esque in terms of media coverage. And I just learned before lunch today, he actually now is topping a state poll in Florida, which is pretty shocking, right? So clearly he keeps having legs, he's keep going. With all the controversy he's generated, with all the people he's insulted, who's pretty much everybody who's not Trump, he is still leading the polls, which is pretty remarkable. And he's also sucking the air. As Amy said, he is sucking the air out of this campaign, which makes it more and more difficult for others to get traction. There's only a certain amount of real estate that's going to be dedicated to primary politics. And if Trump is getting that coverage, that means other people aren't, right? And so he's really creating this sort of whole spectacle around himself that becomes the story, that becomes the media fodder. It's also interesting to look at what he says, because often what he's saying is not that far off from what other candidates say, but their messages are coded. And he doesn't bother with the coding. He doesn't code his messages. He just says that, for better or for worse. And some voters respond very positively to that because they want to hear somebody saying what they really mean and not coding their message in what's considered PC rhetoric. So, as of yesterday, looking at the Real Clear Politics average, polling has Trump at 22%, Jeb Bush at 11%, then Carson at 10%, which is surprisingly high, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then you have sort of everyone else below them. So really, the only ones who are in double digits are Trump, Bush, and Carson. So what we're finding is that the candidates who sort of make it easy to tell a story, particularly Trump, are the ones that wind up getting the attention. They make it easy. They gift wrap the story to write about. And so that winds up sucking up a lot of that energy. What we're finding is there's still difficulty negotiating mainstream Republicans and Tea Party. There's the tension of finding someone who's electable and has the experience to run the country, and someone who's an outsider willing to speak the truth and not be beholden to the party. So you have candidates like Lindsey Graham, who has voted actually with a conservative agenda 90% of the time in the Senate, yet he's considered a Republican in name only, right? So he's at 0.3%. Lindsey Graham is polling at 0.3%. You have Scott Walker, who had a high of 17.3% on April 1st, but has had a steady decline, particularly since Trump came in. He's now down to 7.7. He's got controversy. Unions and educators, not big fans of Scott Walker and what he's done in Wisconsin. And even though he has the support of big money donors and was rumored to be the Koch brothers' choice, he's still having a very difficult time getting energy. Carly Fiorina has no electoral experience. She's running on her business experience, but as people like to note when they write about her, stocks went up from Hewlett-Packard when she resigned. So not a great sign if you're trying to point out your business acumen. And as we saw with Romney, he wasn't able to connect his business experience with running a country, and she has to make that connection as well. Ben Carson is one of the biggest surprises, so I want to make sure I mention him. He's the unlikeliest candidate. He's a neurosurgeon, right? He's a physician. But what people love about him is that he speaks out about being PC. That was how he got on the radar. He came and said, we have to stop being PC. And people are tired of the politically correct language in Washington, at least the people on sort of ends of the spectrum. They want people to speak the truth, and he's believed to do that. Despite the fact that he's polling so well, he's having a hard time getting the media to talk to him or cover him. And even at the debate, he didn't really get a chance to talk until about halfway through. So when Megyn Kelly finally asked him a question, he started his reply with, well, thank you, Megyn. I wasn't sure I was going to get to talk again. This is a guy who's in the top 3 polling, and he can barely get a question answered. And then the only other question they really asked him was about race, and he was the only Republican candidate in that debate asked about race. So the only person they felt the need to ask about race was the black guy on the stage, which is a really interesting decision when racial relations in America are very top of mind and very, very important right now. And getting that diversity of opinion should be an important priority as well. So as we see, the Tea Party still has impact, and we're still facing those negotiations. So my forecast, barring campaign disasters, Kasich will be on the ticket. I think that they're not going to be able to pass up the opportunity to have an Ohio governor on the stage in Cleveland. Now, things can happen, things can change, but I think that's going to be too tempting to pass up because Ohio is so important. I think Trump is going to start to lose ground. I can't imagine by October or November where he starts to really, they start to really think about who do we want to be president. I think that's going to start changing the way people think about him and respond to these polls. And then, most importantly, next month we have another debate. And as we've seen, debates can really change the narrative around these elections. So media frames are going to be there. They're going to help us determine who will be the last man or woman standing in 2016. So thank you guys for your time today. I appreciate it.
Our speaker has graciously agreed to respond to your questions. As I mentioned in the earlier remarks, we have Ask Your Technology. The instructions are in your brochure, so please feel free to pull out your mobile devices. A very engaging presentation. We've already received a number of questions. Also, there are note cards on your table if you prefer to use that, and those note cards will be collected in the questions presented to Danielle.
Thank you. That was absolutely amazing. I have to say, is that better, Joe? Is that better, Joe? The book isn't exactly what you call a beach read. It's a hardback, but we are selling them outside. That's just a shameless plug for the author and the book, which is really a good book if you want to read it instead of watching the rest of the Cleveland Indians series. We've got a number of questions that have come on Ask Her, and I know that Joan is collecting other ones. A lot of them did have to deal with Donald Trump, and you did make a comment about that. You mentioned the impact the media has in framing the candidate. So one of our questions is, so how do you evaluate the impact of Fox News on the political process?
Well, Fox News, as media scholars, Fox News is sort of our favorite thing because it's Fox News. You know, it's something that they've done an amazing job of you know, the whole fair and balance thing. And there's a large contingent of people who believe that Fox News is more honest than other media outlets and that it's more reflective of what's happening. What we see is that Fox can have a certain impact in these primaries. What my research indicated was that Fox is much more likely to give airtime to candidates, to do interviews, to give them lengthy amounts of time to talk. A number of candidates in the past have been Fox News correspondents, you know, so they have a very close relationship with the organization. I think that ultimately, though, Fox News has a group of people who watch Fox News, and much like the other channels, have a group of people who watch them. I think Fox News' impact on the primary is probably greater than it would be on the general election because the people who vote in the Republican primaries are more likely to be watching Fox News than the general electoral body of the United States. And so in the primaries, it's incredibly important, particularly because they are much more likely to do lengthy interviews and sit-down interviews with the candidates. And one thing I just want to add, this is going to be a long answer, I know, but when Fox News hosted the debate in Cleveland earlier this month, one of the big narratives coming out of that was it actually was most effective at giving Fox News credibility. So they were sort of the stars coming out of that. They got that bounce that Michelle Bachmann got. Fox News got that bounce because they were perceived as asking tough questions, right? And so they were perceived to be actually like sort of putting them on the rails, not softballing. And that was something that really, I think, shifted what some people thought Fox News would do because the perception's been so clear that Fox News would be aligned with the candidates.
There are a number of questions that deal with the two parties. And I know you wrote a book on the one party, but there's this other party. And the question has to do with, do you think the media scrutinizes the Democrats as much as it scrutinizes the Republican candidates?
Sure. Absolutely is my answer to that. I think the reason I wrote about Republicans was Obama ran. You know, we had an incumbent president, and so there wasn't really a Democratic primary to talk about. If I were to do this book again, which I'm afraid to look at my husband because he suffered through this process with me, you would have to include the Democrats. And I think ultimately, as I talked about, the media, I think, take their responsibility seriously in terms of really investigating these candidates. And I don't think one party gets an even case than the other. I think if you look at sort of the way Bernie Sanders has been covered, where even though he's getting tens of five-figure people attendees at his rallies, he still isn't getting the same type of coverage that Hillary Clinton is getting as the inevitable. And so I think that you get the same level of scrutiny when you start getting these people who are bursting to the scene who could actually be president. I don't think any candidate sort of at the lower tier gets that level of scrutiny because there's just not time. If you have 17 people running for president, there's only, in one party, there's only so much time you can spend investigating them.
So we all remember Walter Mondale. He won one state, his own, Minnesota. And so, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, Marco Rubio. We have two candidates from Florida, and neither one of them are polling as number one. So what do you think of Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush's chance of even winning their own state?
So, okay, as a scholar, I'm always sort of hesitant to predict or forecast because, we're evidence-based people. So I'm going on record as saying, I don't know. A lot can happen, a lot can change. I think it's telling about the lack of excitement around both of them that Trump has managed to sort of grab Florida from their grasp. It's sort of unheard of for a candidate with Jeb Bush's sort of established history in Florida, his experience as the former governor, his long-term commitment to that state, and who was inevitable. He was an inevitable candidate. For him to not have the top of the polls, or even for Rubio to have it, is pretty shocking. But I think it speaks to how Trump has just really sucked everything up. He's just like an enormous vacuum cleaner, and all the energy and attention goes to him. And as that happens, people in the States are like, yeah, I'm gonna vote for Trump. But there was a really good anecdote from Iowa where, did you guys read about when he went to the state fair and he came in on a helicopter and it was like mayhem, because he's a reality star. For, all these other things, he was a reality star, but there's a celebrity element. And so he's like, high-fiving people, took like one bite off his pork stick and gave it away. And a woman yelled, "We love you, Trump." And the reporter asked her, "Do you mean that?" She's like, "Well, no. Do you?" So, it's one woman in Iowa, but I don't think she's atypical. I think there's the sort of, people like the idea of Trump, the spectacle, in a way that I don't think they'll respond to Trump actually maybe being our president. And I think that when push comes to shove, that'll shift.
Yesterday, our own governor made a comment about if he was king of America, he would get rid of teachers' lounges where they sit there and say, "Woe is us." Every day it's something new, right? So we have a couple of questions about our beloved governor, and does Kasich guarantee Ohio, if only as a vice presidential candidate, and the whole impact of having the Republican convention being held in Ohio? I mean, who didn't think he was going to come in the top 10? And so does that really set the stage that he is being primed for one of the top positions and Cleveland will cinch it for him?
I think there's sort of mixed evidence on the impact of conventions, both on the cities that host them, the economic impact, but also the impact on the actual campaign. But I think that the anecdotal belief is that it makes a difference. I think people believe that if you host this event in a city, it'll help you win that state. We've seen in recent elections that doesn't necessarily work. I mean, North Carolina and Obama are a great example. But I think it's something that the parties very firmly believe, and I think there's something to it. If it's going to be a really, really close election, and Ohio is essential for any presidential candidate, if you can do anything to tip the scales, anything you can do to tip the scales seems important. And that could be having a vice presidential candidate who might not appeal to the Tea Partiers. They really don't like his position on Medicaid, right? And so that's a big, big negative for Kasich when you look at how he polls among Republicans. But I think more moderate Republicans like him, and he probably has more centrist appeal. And I think that having the convention in Cleveland, where it's his home state, and sort of this shining star, environment, it could make a difference. And when you're looking at a very narrow margin, that could be what tips it over. So that's why I think that they'll probably wind up putting him on the ticket. But again, so much can change between now and then. It also depends at who gets it. You know, the downside is if you have a white male governor person in the presidential nomination, bringing another white male governor on as a vice president might not work. They might need to look at reaching out to Hispanics, might look at women. So there's a lot of variables that can come into play. But I think that he has a strong chance because I think they're going to be looking at that very narrow margin and how can they tip it.
We have time for 2 questions, but I do want the Akron Roundtable community to see that there are 3 women up here on the dais. Something you haven't seen since Jack Yeah, I know. You know I had to say that. So the first, again, 2 more questions. One of them is, do you see any other Democrats coming up to run for president?
You know, I do. Well, I do and I don't. So again, academics, hedge answers all the time. You can imagine being in my class when you ask a question. But it's, Hillary Clinton, if she's still polling as well as she is, I think it's a deterrent because people don't want to come in and be the failed candidate. Because what we're seeing more and more recently is that starts to sort of mark you as like, you couldn't do it then, you're not going to do it now. That idea of you lost the last time, so you sort of earned it, you paid your dues, that's changing, I think, in electoral politics. I think depending on what happens with these investigations, we could start to see an impact on Hillary Clinton's numbers. And if she starts to look more vulnerable, I could see another person coming in, particularly a younger Democrat who has a bit more energy and experience. I think one of the downsides looking at the Democrats right now is the average age of our candidates is pretty high. And so I think the Democratic candidates have a very difficult time sort of seeing, is there a path to winning? Is there a path to the nomination? If there's not, then they're not going to do it. If they start to see a path to nomination, then they're more likely to.
Dennis Kucinich might have a chance. So one of the questions, we've dealt a lot with the media influence. So how would somebody get information about the real candidate if it wasn't for the media? And it's important because millennials get their information different. So do you have a comment about that?
Sure. Millennials are still using media. They're just not using media the way we do. You know, so Facebook is a medium, and so they're still going through and finding Twitter and Facebook stories about their candidates of choice. And you know, when you look at the Republicans, we really have an interesting situation where they're trying to reach out and find ways to engage with these millennials when there's so many of them fighting for that real estate. And they're fighting to sort of get into the news feeds and get into the Twitter feeds and whatnot. I think that the challenge is that those sources aren't always vetted. And so when we're looking at our Republican candidates, we're looking at people who are, you know, often trying to sort of push their agenda. And the same thing with the Democrats. They're trying to get out there and say, here's what we think. It's a different era in that we don't have that same vetting. You don't have the gatekeeper, right? You don't have the person saying, okay, this is legitimate news and this isn't. There are some really good things to that, which means more points of view and perspectives are heard. So there's definitely bonuses to that. I think the downside is that oftentimes misinformation is more easily spread and more easily bought because, you know, people don't always think to think about the source of that material. And I think that's where, with the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates, you start getting into a bit of a sticky territory where they're pushing out information through social channels that aren't necessarily vetted. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Okay. I got distracted.
Well, let's give Danielle a round of applause.